It was the sort of night where the stillness in the house seemed almost oppressive, a heavy silence that pressed down on me from all sides. Rebecca, my wife, was on another one of her long business trips. She was supposed to be gone for 2 months, but I hadn't seen her for weeks now. It was strange to have the house to myself like this, especially on a Friday night. The emptiness settled around me in ways I hadn't expected. Even the moonlight seemed to be whispering across the ceiling, casting faint patterns that danced and faded as if it were alive. My mind was scattered, restless, pulled between my loneliness and the deep ache of longing for her presence. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, but my thoughts wouldn't stay still. I kept hearing noises from downstairs, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the sound of something brushing against the walls, and yet no one was supposed to be here. Our son, Ethan, had gone to a friend's place for the weekend. It was only when I heard the faint creak of the bedroom door that I realized I wasn't alone. I turned my head toward the doorway, squinting through the dim light. The figure standing there was familiar, but still, the way they moved made the air in the room feel heavier. Ethan. His broad shoulders were outlined against the faint glow from the hallway, and his silhouette appeared somehow larger, more imposing, like he was carrying a burden he couldn't quite place. He hesitated there in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Dad?" His voice cracked through the silence, soft but weighted with something unspoken. My heart tightened, and I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog in my mind. Ethan never came to my room at this hour, especially not uninvited. Something was wrong. "Ethan, what's going on?" I asked, sitting up and swinging my legs over the side of the bed. I motioned for him to come closer. For a moment, he didn't move. He stood frozen in place, his gaze fixed on the floor, his body rigid. Then he took a hesitant step forward, his bare feet making soft thuds against the carpet. Something in the way he moved slow, almost as if he were afraid added a strange weight to the air between us. I couldn't sleep," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 2:18. The quietness of the house felt like it had swallowed us whole. I felt an unease building in my chest. Ethan wasn't the type to come to me for comfort unless something was seriously bothering him. I cleared my throat and motioned for him to sit next to me on the bed. He hesitated again, then slowly sank down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I could see the tension in his shoulders, his posture stiff as a board. "What's going on?" I asked gently, my voice steady despite the knot that had formed in my stomach. He didn't answer immediately, and I waited, giving him time. His eyes never left the floor, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. "I've been feeling different," he said finally, his voice shaking just slightly. My stomach turned, a small panic creeping in. This was not the conversation I had been expecting tonight. "Different how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my pulse quicken. He met my gaze then, his eyes locking with mine with an intensity I wasn't prepared for. There was something in the way he looked at me, something deep, unspoken, almost too heavy for a father to carry. "It's about someone," he said slowly. "Someone I've been thinking about a lot. Someone you're not going to expect." I let out a breath, trying to keep my composure. "Okay, who is it?" I said, my voice a little softer now, trying to reassure him that he could tell me anything. He shook his head, his eyes once again dropping to the floor. "No, it's not anyone from school." The unease in my chest grew. "Then who is it?" Ethan took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if he were gathering every ounce of courage he had left. The words that came next hit me like a punch to the gut. "It's you, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's always been you." The room went cold. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I couldn't process what he had just said. The air in the room seemed to grow thin, and I was certain I had heard him wrong. "Ethan, what do you mean?" My voice was barely a whisper now, the words stumbling from my lips. He stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the room like a caged animal, his hands running through his hair. He looked disoriented, almost frantic. "I know how it sounds," he said quickly, almost pleading. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I've tried to push it away, tried to ignore it, but it's always there." I was speechless. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. The air felt thick, heavy with something I didn't understand, something that I didn't know how to respond to. "Ethan, this isn't," I stammered, unable to finish my sentence. His eyes flashed with desperation, and before I could say anything else, he cut me off. "Don't tell me it's not real. he interrupted, his voice raw. I know what I feel. I've never felt this way about anyone else. It's not just admiration. It's not a crush. It's something deeper. I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. My mind was reeling, but my body was frozen, unable to react. My son, my own flesh and blood, was telling me that he loved Menet as a son, but as something else. Something I couldn't understand. I forced myself to speak again, though the words barely escaped my lips. Ethan, you're my son. I'm your dad. What you're feeling, it's not love. It's something else. His eyes were glassy, his voice trembling as he responded. It is love, Dad. You're everything to me. You're the only one who's ever made me feel like I'm worth something. How can that not be love? Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't cry. I didn't know what to feel. My son, the boy I had raised and loved with all my heart, was confessing something I wasn't prepared to hear. Something that was beyond anything I could understand or process. I reached out to him, placing a hand on his arm, trying to offer some comfort, though I didn't have the words. Ethan, these feelings you're having, they'll pass. I promise you, they'll pass. And when they do, you'll see things more clearly. But Ethan's gaze didn't soften. Instead, it hardened with determination. What if they don't? He whispered. What if this is who I am? What if this is how I'm supposed to feel? I had no answer for him. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't. All I could offer was silence. And in that silence, I held onto the hope that somehow time would heal this, that somehow things would return to normal. But deep down, I knew this moment would not fade so easily. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was only the beginning of something that would change everything. The morning after Ethan's confession, everything felt wrong. The house, usually a place of refuge, felt more like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every familiar object around me seemed to echo with an unspoken tension. I tried to go through the motions of my day coffee, breakfast, a few chores, but my hands trembled. My mind raced, each thought like a wild animal, refusing to be tamed. What did this mean for us? For Ethan? For me? I busied myself with things that didn't require much thought-sorting laundry, wiping down the counters, but nothing could distract me. The silence between Ethan and me was overwhelming. It was as though the world had been turned upside down, and I wasn't sure how to write it again. I kept waiting for him to speak, for the tension to break, but it didn't. I heard him move around the house, and though he never seemed far, he might as well have been on another planet. It was as if there was an invisible wall between us now, one that I couldn't tear down. Eventually, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a bowl of cereal. He hadn't touched it. The air was thick with everything unsaid, and the tension made it hard to breathe. His hair was a mess, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The weight of last night hung between us like a thick fog that neither of us could clear. Morning, I said cautiously, sitting down across from him. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Morning, he replied, his voice hoarse, the heaviness of the night before still clinging to it. I watched him for a long moment, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched on between us, a chasm that neither of us seemed willing to cross. I sighed and poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to find something familiar in the mundane act. The sound of the liquid filling the mug was louder than it should have been, a reminder that nothing about today felt normal. After a moment, I sat across from him, the space between us feeling both too far and too close. I broke the silence first, my voice quiet but steady. Ethan, about last night. He interrupted me before I could continue, his voice more firm than I expected. I'm not going to pretend I didn't mean it, he said, his eyes locking with mine. I meant every word. My heart ached at the rawness in his voice, but I had to remain steady. I know you're being honest, I said softly. But Ethan, what you're feeling, it's not something we can act on. It's not something we should act on. His gaze hardened, and he leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly. Why not? He asked, the frustration evident in his voice. Why can't it just be love? Why does love have to fit into these rules and boundaries? Isn't love supposed to be free? I felt the weight of his words settle over me, and I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Love isn't just about what we feel, Ethan. It's about what's right, about what's good for everyone involved. What you're saying, it could hurt both of us. It could change everything. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched tightly. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. That's the last thing I want. I reached across the table, my hand trembling slightly as I placed it over his. I don't want to hurt you either, I whispered. That's why we have to handle this carefully. We need to find a way to move past this. Ethan's fingers tightened around mine, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who had always looked to me for guidance, the boy who trusted me. But this was different. This wasn't just father and son. This was something else, something that neither of us knew how to navigate. I don't know if I can move past it, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'll try. For you? Tears welled in my eyes, but I fought them back, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. That's all I ask, I said softly. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. Everything between us had shifted, but we couldn't talk about it. There were no words for what had happened, no way to make it go away. I tried to keep things normal, to keep us close in small, familiar ways. We ate dinner together, went about our routines, but the weight of the silence never truly lifted. Ethan kept his distance, retreating to his room, spending more time out of the house than I was comfortable with. But I missed him. I missed the boy who used to laugh at my bad jokes, who would sit with me on the couch watching television. I missed the ease of our relationship before everything had changed. One evening, a week or so later, I heard the sound of the front door closing. I glanced up to see Ethan stepping into the kitchen, his hair damp from the rain. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to decide if he should say something. Hey, I said, trying to keep my tone light. You're just in time. Dinner's almost ready. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the counter, leaning against it with his arms crossed. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice low but firm. I've been thinking, he said, and I could hear the weight in his words. About what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though a part of me was already bracing for the worst. He looked up at me then, his gaze steady. About us? He said. What you said the other night. I've been thinking about it, and I think I understand. I held my breath, unsure where this conversation would lead. I don't want to lose what we have, he continued, his voice quiet but resolute. Even if it's not what I want it to be, I'd rather have you as my dad than not have you at all. Relief washed over me, though it was tempered with the sadness in his voice. You're not going to lose me, Ethan, I said, my voice firm. No matter what, I'll always be here for you. He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. I know, he whispered, but it's hard. It's really hard. I stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. It's going to take time, I said gently. But you're strong, Ethan, and I'm here to help you through it, however I can. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the tension between us seemed to ease, even if just for a breath. Thanks, Dad, he said, his voice soft. That means a lot. We stood there in the kitchen, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. For the first time in days, it felt like things might be okay. But life, as always, had a way of complicating things when you least expected it. The uneasy truce between us held for a time fragile but functional. Ethan tried to smile more, to laugh at my jokes, and we ate meals together like we used to. I clung to those moments, convincing myself that things were improving. But late at night, when the house was silent and I was alone with my thoughts, the weight of his confession still hung in the air, a reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. One evening, after a long day of work, I found Ethan in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring at the television. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. Are you okay? I asked, my voice soft. He shrugged, his gaze never leaving the screen. Yeah, just thinking. I hesitated before speaking again. About anything in particular? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. When am I not thinking about this? He said, his voice low. My stomach twisted. Ethan, I thought we were moving past this. I'm trying, he said quickly, turning to face me. I really am, but it's not that simple. You can't just turn feelings off like a switch. I nodded, my heart heavy. I know, I said softly, and I don't expect you to. But we have to keep working on this, for both our sakes. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. Have you ever thought about it? He asked suddenly, his voice low. About us? About what it would be like if things were different? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I froze. What was he asking me? I didn't have an answer,